Hello everyone, and welcome to our training session today on the Lost Schools of Gloucester. I'm Karen and I'm one of the Senior Archivists here at Gloucestershire Archives. Firstly, a little bit of housekeeping. Can you please put yourselves on mute if you haven't already? Any problems or questions, please put them in the chat and we'll answer them we'll answer problems as we go along and questions at the very end. And also just to let you know that we're recording this session to be put on our YouTube channel later. So if you don't want to be featured in the recording, please turn your camera off now. Thank you. The session will last about an hour in total. Firstly, we're going to spend about 30 minutes looking at the types of school records that we hold here, and then we'll show you a digital story about some of Gloucester's lost schools, which will last for about 20 minutes. And then we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. So if you've got any questions, please just pop them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them at the end of the session. So we're going to start today by looking at the various types of records held in our collections, which we can use to find out about the county's schools, including schools which no longer exist. We'll look at what types of records there are and why they were kept, what they can tell us, and how you can approach finding useful and relevant records. Firstly, a couple of key facts about archives. They start life as working documents created in the course of the daily activities of an individual or an organisation. This means that there was a specific business purpose for creating and keeping them, and informing historians of the future is just a side effect. So sometimes they don't always make all the sense on their own, and you do have to know a little bit about why they were created to be able to make sense of them. And wholesale standardised record keeping was often a byproduct of legislation via Acts of Parliament. So that gives you a little bit of background. So one of the things that we do when we're training as archivists is to study what we call administrative history. So the history of the legislation and administration that surrounded the provision of various services, including the education service. And it's worth bearing this in mind as a researcher because it can help you understand why certain records exist, what date they exist from, and so on. And this also gives you another approach to help navigate our collections. So what we hold and don't hold can seem quite random at first look, and records often haven't survived to come to us, but there is a logic to what we have, and I'm going to try and bring that through as we look at the records. So the records which can help us find out about schools in the past fall into various categories. We've got records produced by the schools themselves and their pupils, records about or relating to the schools, often produced by the organisations who ran them, like churches, charities, Gloucester Corporation and Gloucestershire County Council, in our case locally. There are records drawn up to show the built environment, which of course includes school buildings. And there is physical evidence from the landscape and buildings, which is not strictly speaking the domain of an archivist, but of course it's very important to consider. And one of the things to consider in this building, and I don't know if you can hear them, is that we do get seagulls on the roof. I do apologise for the seagulls. We haven't been able to persuade them to keep their mouths shut, unfortunately, so hopefully they're not going to be too disruptive. And we also have books about the schools written by and for local historians. Again, these are not strictly speaking archival, but they often draw on original archive material. And used together, these records can tell us about the school as a building, when it was built and why, quite often, when it was demolished, what it looked like, the life of the school, the running and management, who attended, who taught there, the subjects and syllabus that was taught, all of that sort of thing. So we're going to now dive in and have a look at the records. All of the examples that you see here today relate to various lost schools from Gloucester. That is, schools that have moved or that have closed, and in most cases the buildings themselves have been demolished, as you'll see in our digital story, which we'll show you a little bit later. So the first category of records we're going to look at is records created by the schools. And this is the type of material you'll probably be most familiar with. And just putting the archivist hat on briefly, we'll give you a little bit of administrative history. Pause for applause from the seagulls. There was no standard practice for keeping school records before the Elementary Education Act of 1870, which is when the government started to get involved with universal education, meaning that every child got an education. And prior to that, you pretty much only got an education if your parents had money to send you to a grammar school, or if you had got yourself a scholarship to one of those schools. But following the 1870 Act, everybody should be given an education. And this Act also standardised record keeping, and because records were kept systematically from this date, they've got a higher survival rate. And the two most common types of records to survive post-1870 are admission registers and logbooks. And the first example that I've got to show you is an admission register for St Catherine's School, dating from 1905 to 1917. And these registers usually include each pupil's name, their date of birth, date of admission and leaving, their last school attended, name and address of parents or guardians, and quite often, here in the right-hand column, the reason for leaving, and quite often it'll give you the school that they went to. So we've got 1 or 2 attending private schools, 1 or 2 getting scholarships, lots of people leaving the district in this one. So it tells you where you might want to look next if you're following this child through their school career. They're key records. They're clearly very useful for family and local historians, but they can also be useful in other ways. And recently, during the Windrush scandal, we were able to help a gentleman who came in wanting to prove that his mother was entitled to remain in the country. And we managed to find her in an admission register from a secondary school in the city of Gloucester, and to prove that she was here receiving an education in Gloucester before the cut-off date for people being allowed to stay in the country. And so that was really rather satisfying. Now, the second example that we've got for you is a logbook. There we go. And this is a logbook for Archdeacon Street School. And in fact, you might be able to see that when the first logbook started in 1878, it was called Deacon Street. And the name didn't actually change to Archdeacon Street until about 1908, 1909, I think. Now, logbooks are like a diary for the school, and they're written by the head teacher. They're mandatory, or at least they were. They had to be kept up until the 1990s. Now it's optional, and I think most head teachers have more than enough to be doing, so they don't end up writing up a logbook as such. But logbooks are extremely informative. They record the life of the school. You can see there are lots of dated entries. They record key events, absences for any reason, sickness, so you can track infections and disease, that sort of thing. Also absences for economic and social reasons, such as fruit picking, helping with the harvest, looking after siblings. Also, they record visits by important people, inspections, exam results, the syllabus that was taught, dates of staff joining and leaving. And what perhaps might be a little bit less appreciated, but is very significant to us as archivists and anyone else trying to make sense of the history of the school, is that the logbook helps us to create the all-important administrative history. So it includes information like schools merging, splitting apart, changing from single-sex to co-ed and back again quite often, changing from an all-age school to just a primary school, or splitting into infants and junior schools, or infant and junior schools joining, so on and so forth. And as you'll appreciate when you see the digital story, Archdeacon Street has had a very complicated history, and the logbooks have been absolutely invaluable in helping us to work that out. You might find other records which schools have created. So there are some examples, such as punishment books, which we've got one here. And this is from Mount Street School, which you'll also be hearing about in the digital story. And it covers 1901 up to 1973. And after the closure of Mount Street School in the late 50s, it was used by Kingsholm Secondary School. And we're showing you an early entry because entries less than 100 years old in punishment books are closed under data protection legislation, except for those they actually relate to. So we can show you the things that are over 100 years old, but you might just be able to see that we've tied off the rest of the book so that we don't accidentally show you something that we shouldn't. Now, most of our records have no restrictions on access, and we generally only restrict access to records that contain personal information for data protection purposes. And where there are restrictions, this will be clearly marked in the catalogue for you. Now, other records that you might find, more informal records, might include, such as this one, scrapbooks. So this is a scrapbook from King's Home School in Alvin Street, which closed in 1973 and is in fact now home to Gloucestershire Archives and the Heritage Hub. And this one covers 1947 to 1952, and it's full of photographs and information about sports competitions and lots of group class photographs, all sorts of things, news cuttings. So that can be really useful in helping you to find out a little bit more about the life of the school. We also have some photograph albums. So this one is from St Michael's School, and this one was kept by somebody who had been a teacher at the school, who then much later gave it to us. So we've got here a group photo from the school play, and then over the page we've got a couple of photos. Let's turn that up. So playtime and activities. So I think that might be a sandpit in the top picture, if you can see, and then a toy horse in the bottom picture. So that's rather nice, and it shows you the sorts of things that they got up to at the school. And other more informal records include visitors' books, like this one that we're about to show you. So this looks like it's a record of important visitors to the school, so quite probably inspectors, church representatives, that sort of thing. We've marked a couple of entries, so there is praise for the headmistress in this entry here. And then over the page, there are some notes about the poor state of the building of this school, and this is St Catherine's again, which closed in 1973. And then sometimes we also have records created by the pupils themselves, and this is rather special. This is a copybook that was created by a pupil at the Crypt Grammar School when it was in Southgate Street in 1834. And you might notice that this actually predates the 1870 Education Act. It's not a formal record of the school. It was kept by a pupil and then eventually came to us privately rather than directly from the school. And it's full of worthy sayings like value and improved time, written out very nicely. So that's rather lovely. And another set of records created by pupils, which you often find, are school magazines. And this is also from the Crypt, and this is from its time in Brunswick Road. A nice bound volume of Crypt school magazines, and you'll find all sorts of information in school magazines. They especially crop up for secondary schools. And there'll be lots of notes about what's been happening in the school that term. Quite a lot about football and cricket in the Crypt ones. Bits about former pupils, all sorts of interesting information to be found in the school magazines. Here we go. So we'll move on now to the second main category that I was talking about, which is records created by organisations involved with the provision of education. So like the charities, the church, and more recently Gloucester Corporation and Gloucestershire County Council. These are less about the day-to-day life and running of the school, but they're more likely to shed light on strategic issues such as where the school was built and why. You can sometimes see political issues coming through, and they also often deal with the aspects of the build and include plans and sketches. And sometimes you can track social movements through these sorts of records. So I've noticed you can track the baby boom through the records of Gloucestershire County Council's Education Department, because in the late 1940s you get lots of need for extra infant places and extra infant furniture, and head teachers writing on, I need much more small size infant chairs. And then a few years later, early 1950s, you're getting a need for more junior places, extra classrooms for junior pupils, junior size furniture. And then by the late 50s, they're all needing to go to secondary school, and so suddenly there's a need for more secondary school places. And then by the middle 1960s, the need for secondary school places is dropping off because they're all leaving school. So that's been really interesting to find out when working with these records. Now, for Gloucester, for the city, records of this type are mainly to be found in the archive of Gloucester Corporation, and more specifically in the records of the Education Department. Between 1903, when the local education authorities were created following the Education Act 1902, and 1974, when the responsibility for education in the city passed to the County Council Education Department. So the next document that we've got to show you is rather large, and it's a plan showing the catchment areas for various Gloucester city schools. We've got St Catherine's over here near St Oswald Road, Kingsholm Infants, which was in the southeast end of this building. St Michael's, we can't show you all of it because it's far too big, but St Michael's is down here. St Michael's was in Russell Street, as you'll see in the digital story, and then St Mark's up in Kingsholm here. And this comes from a file relating to the proposed closure of all of these schools and replacement with a new primary school in Kingsholm. And there are several files on this matter because the issue was quite controversial at the time, mainly because there was no site that pleased all the parents of all the children who would have to come to the school. They were all concerned about children crossing busy roads and all that sort of thing, so that there are a lot of correspondence and petitions and so on and so forth about these. But you can just see the coloured houses incidentally indicate where the children lived. Now, another example from these files is we've got some plans and drawings of the technical and art colleges in Brunswick Road, and this is when the technical college was being built in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And this one's rather nice because we've got a list of the rooms needed for the art college, and then various plans and notes and so on, woodwork shop. So this is, I think, from fairly early on in the process, and we do have also a lot of plans and drawings showing the building and showing lots of fantastic Art Deco details in the building itself. Now, churches and religious organisations and charities also often had a role in education, especially before the state got involved in the mid-19th century. So we'll have a look at a few examples of relevant records which they generated. And firstly, we've got the rules from the British school, which was Wellington Street School. And this started life as a so-called British school. And the British schools were non-denominational, which was very important at the time. It's specified in the rules without any distinction as to religious sect or denomination. And this is in deliberate contrast to the more numerous national schools, which were founded by the National Society to provide elementary education in accordance with the teaching of the Church of England to the children of the poor. And this distinction is often very important because people wanted to send their children to a school that aligned with their own religious beliefs. So one of the other documents that we've got is a deed conveying land to, here we are, to the Vicar and Churchwardens of St Mary de Lode, so Church of England Church in the city of Gloucester, of a site for an infant and girls' school for that parish, which ended up being St Nicholas School, which we'll see a little bit more about in the digital story. And there were also, of course, charity schools. So the Crypt is a good example of a school which started as a charitable foundation under the will of John Cook, a merchant who died in 1528. And the copybook that we looked at earlier comes from the Crypt from 1834, so well before the 1870 Education Act. Now, the next category to think of are records relating to the built environment, and maps of various types are the obvious example in this category. And the good news here is that you can access now many key maps online. Here's a postcard advertising the Know Your Place website, and I'm just going to turn it over because it's got the website address on it. This website, once you've got a location for the building you're looking at, it allows you to trace it over the years through maps of different dates. So we've got the Ordnance Survey from the 1880s up to the 1950s in some cases. We've got tithe and enclosure maps. We've got the map drawn up for the Board of Health in Gloucester from 1851. So you can trace it back through time by overlaying different maps on each other. And the web address, in case it's not clear in the picture, is www.kypwest.org.uk. Or if you Google Know Your Place West of England, that will take you to it. And that actually covers Gloucestershire, South Gloucestershire, Bristol, and several other counties in the southwest. So it's not just limited to Gloucestershire. And another category we've got is plans and drawings, and we've got a really nice little set of plans, thank you, submitted. Let's try and see if we can get this in the middle of the image. Submitted to the Board of Education for approval as school buildings. So you had to get approval from the Board of Education, which would be, I suppose, the Department for Education and Science now in central government, for your school before you could build it. And so this is St Nicholas, which was on the corner of Key Street and Lower Key Street, and you'll see a little bit more about it in the digital story. These lovely plans aren't featured in the digital story because unfortunately they're still in copyright, but we're just giving you a very quick glimpse before I just sweep them out of the way again. There we go. And then this leads us on to physical evidence from the landscape and the buildings. And where the buildings still exist, you can look out for giveaway architectural features. So, for example, in the old King's Home School building, the building I'm standing in now, if you look up at the door frames over the original doors, they've got boys and girls carved in the stone over the relevant entrances. And also at King's Home, here's a rather marvellous photo of some graffiti that's been scratched into the bricks. And the one at the top says 1957, the girls left. And that is a reference to the secondary school girls going to the new Winifred Cullis School at Barnwood, which is now Barnwood Park College. Now, it's often easy to spot buildings which started life as schools, as they tended to be built by similar designs, influenced by the prevailing architectural styles of the time. So, for example, in the late 19th and early 20th century, when many schools were being built, they tend to have pointed gables and high Gothic arched windows, whereas schools built in the 1950s and 1960s tend to be rectangular, flat-roofed, and have walls consisting mostly of windows. Also, if you know roughly where a school was, you may be able to spot it on the ground by finding buildings that don't fit the surroundings or a gap in the existing buildings. So Mount Street is a really good example, as you'll see in the digital story. The building was demolished in the 1980s and houses built on the site, and the houses look very different from the Victorian terraced houses on the rest of the street. And then very quickly, just finally, we've focused today on archives, but we've also got an excellent selection of books. So just to mention the Victoria County History, which we'll just sweep in front of you. There we go. So this is a very thorough history written by professional historians based in the archives because they need constant access to the material that we hold. And they are working their way gradually around the county, and they've been at it since the 1960s. Luckily for us, if you're studying the schools in Gloucester, they've covered Gloucester very thoroughly. And there's a very thorough section on education that begins here. And you can probably just about see the copious footnotes, which give you references to all of the documents that they used. So it will give you good jumping off points for your own research. And then we also have quite a lot of books of photographs, including this rather marvellous one called Gloucester from Old Photographs, which Phil Moss and Derek Hall put together a few years ago from photographs taken by John Rowden, who spent quite a lot of time taking photos in the 1960s. So we'll just have a quick flick through there, and I've got page marked for here, this one, pop it in the centre. And that's one of the first Sunday schools in Gloucester, which used to stand on the corner of Park Street and St Catherine Street. And I'd like to say a really, really big thank you to Phil and Derek, and also to Louise Rowden, John's daughter, for permission to use some of the images from this book in the digital story. And in fact, some of John Rowden's photographs are the only ones that I've been able to find of some of these buildings. So I'm absolutely indebted to them for that, and thank you very much. And then we've also got, available on our website, we have a mini research guide on school records and what they are and how to use them. And you can find that on our website. And then we've also got a quick administrative history of education, mostly in Gloucester, but it does apply to the wider county as well. And that will be available in the next few days from the events page on our website, if you're interested. So we've had a look at what records survive and why they were kept and what they can tell us. Just a quick reminder, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat facility, and then I will try and answer them at the end. But for now, we're going to show you a digital story which lasts about 20 minutes and focuses on 18 of Gloucester's lost schools. It's going to tell you a little bit more about the history of each one, and it's illustrated with images of relevant material in the archives and a few photos of what the sites look like today. And this digital story is based on a walk which was first launched at the Gloucester History Festival in 2019. If you'd like to do the walk yourself and visit the various sites in person, we've produced a map with directions which you'll be able to download from the events page on our website over the next few days. So now we'll put the digital story on. Let's take a look at some of the lost schools that used to exist in Gloucester city centre. We're going to start with Kingsholm School, which is on Alvin Street. The school opened on the 11th of October 1926 as an infant school and a mixed school for older children up to the age of 14. In 1931, the city schools were reorganised and Kingsholm became Kingsholm Senior Girls' School and Kingsholm Infant School, the juniors transferring elsewhere and the senior boys going to Archdeacon Street, which we'll take a look at in a minute. The infant school continued in the eastern half of the building, the western half being occupied by the senior school, later the secondary modern school, until its closure in 1962. The secondary girls transferred to the new Winifred Cullis School in Barnwood in 1957, which later became Barnwood Park. And on the closure of Kingsholm Infant School in 1962, the boys' senior school expanded into the former infants part of the premises. Kingsholm Secondary School closed eventually in 1973, and the pupils transferred gradually to St Bridge School, which is now Gloucester Academy. The site and buildings were transferred to the County Council along with the rest of the City Education Service when local government was reorganised in 1974, and the buildings were used as a teachers' centre for a few years. In 1979, the Gloucestershire Record Office moved in, having outgrown its previous accommodation, and remains there today as the Gloucestershire Heritage Hub. Now we'll move on to St Catherine's School, which stood on the corner of Priory Road and St Oswald's Road. And a national school was opened in about 1835 to the north of the old St Catherine's Church, which stood on the site alongside what is now Gowder Way and incorporated some of the ruins of the old priory there. The school seems to have functioned in its early days as the Girls and Infants Department of London Road National School, and it was known as Gloucester Girls National School. It later became known as St Catherine's School and served the parishes of St Catherine and St Mary de Lode until 1868, when St Mary de Lode School was opened on Mount Street, and the two schools had a lot of connections throughout their history. In 1876, a new building was opened to the west of the new St Catherine's Church, which had been built on the site of the old one in 1869, and the school still catered for girls and infants. St Mary de Lode School closed in 1901, and the nursery department of St Catherine's School used the building from 1901 to 1907, when the Board of Education ordered that this building be closed and the nursery department returned to the main school.
The former St Mary de Lode buildings were improved, and in 1910 the whole infants department of St Catherine's School transferred there, and we'll talk a little bit more about Mount Street School in a few minutes. St Catherine's operated as a girls' school for pupils aged 7 to 14 until the general reorganisation of city schools in 1931, when St Catherine's became a junior girls' school for pupils aged 7 to 11. The older girls transferred mainly to Kingsholm Senior School. In 1938, the top class from Mount Street Infant School was transferred back to the St Catherine's building. So there was a lot of toing and froing between Mount Street and St Catherine's in the middle 20th century, as you can tell. By 1952, although St Catherine's was a girls' school, boys aged 6 were also admitted from Mount Street on the Archdeacon Street Infant School and allowed to stay for 2 years because there were dangerous roads between their homes and other schools. And road safety on school routes was a concern for both parents and the City Council during the 1950s and 1960s as more motor traffic began to appear on the city's roads. In 1955, the infant school closed and St Catherine's became a primary school, taking children aged between 3 and 11. However, the buildings were ageing and local pressure for a new school on an adjacent site was unsuccessful. The new Kingsholm Church of England Junior School opened in 1962, and the junior girls transferred there, and then in 1973 the Kingsholm School was enlarged to take infants and St Catherine's closed completely. Now we'll move on to Mount Street School, which is on the corner of St Oswald's Road and Mount Street. St Mary de Lode National School opened in 1868 as a girls' and infants school and closed in 1901, the pupils transferring to the nearby St Catherine's School. And as we've already heard, the nursery department of St Catherine's used the building between 1902 and 1907, although it had to move back to St Catherine's when the Board of Education decreed the buildings unsuitable. After some renovation works, Mount Street Temporary Infant School was opened in the former St Mary de Lode School buildings in January 1910, taking the whole infants department of St Catherine's. However, although it was intended to be temporary, the school remained open until 1955. The building was flooded by the River Severn in March 1947, as you can see from the photograph we've got here. In September 1948, the school transferred to 3 rooms of the buildings formerly occupied by Archdeacon Street Senior School, which we'll talk about more in a few moments, and became known as Archdeacon Street Infant School. The school closed permanently in 1955. The buildings in Mount Street were sold in 1958 and at first were used as a commercial store until the site was required for the road development scheme widening Priory Road and creating St Oswald's Road. And then some houses were built on the site in about the 1980s. Moving on to Archdeacon Street School, Deacon Street Board School opened in 1899, replacing the endowed free school or poor school. It catered for boys and infants at the beginning, although in December 1899 the infants were transferred to St Nicholas National School. Evening continuation classes, which were intended for men and older boys who had left school, were provided from 1899. The City Education Committee took over the school in 1903 following the Education Act of 1902 and provided new school buildings in 1910 and 1911. The school's name was changed to Archdeacon Street School in 1911, reflecting the change in street name from Deacon Street to Archdeacon Street, which presumably took place around the same time. In September 1931, the city schools were reorganised, and Archdeacon Street School became a senior boys' school for pupils aged 11 to 14. In September 1939, Archdeacon Street Senior Boys' School and Kingsholm Senior Girls' School amalgamated to form Kingsholm Senior Mixed School, using the Kingsholm buildings in Alvin Street. The Archdeacon Street premises were used for a short time by the art and technical colleges as a junior technical school, and then they were requisitioned during the Second World War. In 1948, the pupils from Mount Street Infant School were transferred to part of the Archdeacon Street buildings, as we've heard, becoming known as Archdeacon Street Primary Infant School. This school closed in 1955. Between 1949 and 1963, part of the Archdeacon Street premises were used as a special school, known as Archdeacon Street Junior School. The pupils were transferred to Longford School when it expanded to take junior children as well as secondary age pupils in 1963. Following the closure of the special school, the premises were used for various educational purposes, including as a teachers' centre and an annex of the College of Technology. Ownership of the premises passed with the rest of the City Education Service to Gloucestershire County Council on local government reorganisation in 1974, and it was used for some time as a staff training centre, and this is one of the very few of these lost schools whose buildings still survive today. We'll move on now to St Nicholas School, which stood at the corner of Upper Quay Street and Quay Street. Now, St Nicholas Infant School was established in December 1830 and a new building was provided for it on the corner of Castle Lane and Bearland in 1833. Around 1870, the school began to take older girls as well as infants, and in 1872, a new building was opened almost opposite the old school at the junction of Quay Street and what was then called Upper Quay Lane. It had accommodation for boys, girls and infants departments, but the boys department closed temporarily between 1875 and 1877 due to lack of funds and closed permanently in 1898. The boys mainly transferred to Deacon Street School, which later became known as Archdeacon Street School. The City Education Committee took over the school in 1903 following the Education Act of 1902, and by the 1920s the buildings were considered unsuitable for older children. The girls over 11 were transferred to St Catherine's School in 1926. When the city schools were reorganised in 1931, the junior girls also transferred elsewhere, and St Nicholas became an infant school. However, it closed in 1933, and the buildings were demolished in 1937 to make way for the CWS Creamery. Later, the site was used as a car park for many years, and is now occupied by student accommodation. Now we will move on to Barrack Square, where the Domestic Science College was for a long time. This was a college for training teachers of domestic science, the Gloucestershire School of Cookery and Domestic Economy. It opened in 1891 in part of the old gas company offices in Quay Street and moved to the old barracks in 1894. It was renamed the Gloucestershire School of Domestic Science in 1900 and was run by a subcommittee of the County Council's Education Committee. In 1925, the school was renamed the Gloucestershire Training College of Domestic Science, and in 1958 the college moved to new buildings at Oxstalls. From 1962 it provided general teacher training and was renamed the Gloucestershire College of Education in 1967. It closed in 1980 and the Gloucestershire College of Art and Technology, or GLOSCAT, used the Oxstalls buildings for some years. Eventually, though, the Oxstalls site became part of the campus of the University of Gloucestershire. Also in the barracks was the Gloucester Dairy School, which opened in 1889, initially in a building in Station Road, and had moved to the barracks by 1899. The County Council had taken it over by 1906, and they ran it as the Gloucestershire County Dairy School until the late 1920s. We'll move on to the Crypt School, which has had 4 sites over its history. Now, originally, it stood in Southgate Street. The Crypt School was founded by the will of John Cook, who was a mercer who died in 1528. He'd been twice High Sheriff of the city of Gloucester in 1494 and 1498, and 4 times Mayor of the city in 1501, 1507, 1512 and 1519. His will was carried out by his widow and sole executrix, whose name was Joan, and a schoolroom was built next to St Mary de Crypt Church in Southgate Street. It's known to have been operating by 1539, and that building is still there today. In 1861, the school moved to new buildings in Barton Street, having been closed for 4 years. It moved again to Friars Orchard in Brunswick Road in 1887, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. Notable old Cryptians who attended the school while it was in Southgate Street and Barton Street include George Whitfield, who attended 1726 to 1731, John Moore, Archbishop of Canterbury, who attended 1739 to 1744, Robert Raikes, who attended in the 1730s to 1740s, although his exact dates at the school are not known, John Lightfoot, the botanist, who attended in the 1740s to 1750s, and W. E. Henley, the poet, playwright and critic, who attended 1861 to 1867. Now, the Crypt School moved to Friars Orchard on Brunswick Road in 1887. By the 1930s, the school was becoming very overcrowded, and this, together with the construction of the new technical college, which later became known as Gloucestershire College of Art and Technology, or GLOSCAT, and then Gloucestershire College, on the Friars Orchard site, and this prompted a move to new buildings in Podsmead. The foundation stone was laid by the Duchess of Gloucester in 1939, and in 1943 the new buildings were opened to pupils, the war having considerably hampered their construction. Delays were also caused by problems with the architect, which eventually resulted in a pair of court cases. Notable old Cryptians who attended the school while it was at Friars Orchard include Harold Costley White, Dean of Gloucester, who attended 1886 to 1888, H.D.F. Kitto, the classicist, who attended 1909 to 1916, R.G. Austin, another classicist, who attended 1909 to 1918, and Brian Chapman Frith, MBE FSG local historian, who attended 1923 to 1934, and while at the school masterminded an archaeological dig at the front corner of the site to find part of the city wall. The prominent archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler visited the dig. Now we come to the technical and art colleges. A School of Art opened at Bearland House in 1859, and evening classes in science began in the city in 1867, and they later moved with the art classes to the new Schools of Science and Art in Brunswick Road, which opened in 1872. The corporation took over the schools in 1896. In 1906, they passed to the United Schools Governors, who also ran the city secondary schools, the Crypt Grammar School, Sir Thomas Rich's, and Denmark Road, the High School for Girls. In 1933, the United Schools and Colleges passed back to the City Education Authority. The Science School became known as the Technical School and then the Technical College during the first decades of the 20th century. In 1941, the Technical College moved to new buildings on the Friars Orchard site formerly occupied by the Crypt School, although the school's original buildings remained standing behind the new college building until the 1960s, when they were demolished to make way for the college extension and tower block, which were opened in 1967 and 1974. The art school was renamed the College of Art in 1952, and in 1968 it moved into new buildings on the east side of Brunswick Road. The College of Art merged with the Art College at Cheltenham to form the Gloucestershire College of Art and Design in 1968, and in 1981 the Art and Technical Colleges merged to form the Gloucestershire College of Arts and Technology, otherwise known as GLOSCAT, which is now Gloucestershire College. Both sets of buildings on either side of Brunswick Road have recently been demolished and replaced with flats after the college moved to its new building at Lanthony. But you can see the old door from the Technical College on the front of one of the new blocks of flats on Brunswick Road. Meanwhile, the original Schools of Science and Art are now used by Gloucester City Library and the Gloucester Museum. Moving a little further down Brunswick Road, when we come to the corner of Brunswick Road and Park Road, this was the site of Christ Church School, which opened in around 1831 as a charity school for girls and infants run by the Vicar of Christ Church, originally in premises in Barton Street. New buildings were built at the junction of what is now Brunswick Road and Park Road in about 1839. The school became a national school in 1847. Following the Education Act of 1902, the City Education Committee took over responsibility for Christ Church School, except for building repairs and alterations, and in 1907 the school's name was changed from Christ Church National School to Christ Church Church of England School. When the city schools were reorganised in 1931, Christ Church became an infant school. The school closed in July 1958 due to the outdated buildings and a decline in the child population in the city centre and consequent fall in pupil numbers. The buildings were used by Sir Thomas Rich's School and the College of Art for a while, but they were eventually demolished in 1971. Now, the British School was opened in Wellington Street in 1841 and was run along the lines of the British and Foreign Schools Society, which was non-denominational, as opposed to the National Society, which was Church of England. The school managers handed the British school over to the Gloucester School Board in 1900 owing to financial difficulties which prevented them from being able to provide additional accommodation to ease the overcrowding in the school, and the board closed the infants department, which helped with the overcrowding. In 1903, the school transferred to the City Education Committee, following the Education Act of 1902, and the City Authority changed the school's name to Wellington Street School in 1905. In 1931, the city schools were reorganised and Wellington Street closed. The buildings were used for some time by the Health Visitors Service for handing out milk tokens to mothers who needed them, and they were later used by Sir Thomas Rich's School, which was next door. The school buildings were demolished in the 1960s, presumably after Sir Thomas Rich's School moved out to their new site at Elmbridge. Now, Sir Thomas Rich's School was founded under the will of Sir Thomas Rich in 1666, and it opened in Sir Thomas's former house in Eastgate Street in 1668. It was known as the Blue Coat School, as Sir Thomas's will stipulated that the boys should wear blue coats and caps, as at Christ's Hospital in London. The municipal charity trustees took over the finances of the school from Gloucester Corporation in the late 1830s, and in 1882 the governors of Gloucester United Schools were established to run Sir Thomas Rich's Crypt and a new secondary school for girls, which eventually became the High School for Girls at Denmark Road. And the school's name was officially changed from the Blue Coat School to Sir Thomas Rich's School, although, of course, in the city it is known almost exclusively as Tommy Rich's. The crypt provided grammar school education, and Sir Thomas Rich's catered for the non-grammar school boys. The school moved to the former Crypt School building in Barton Street in 1889, and the Guildhall was built on the old site. In 1945, following the Education Act of 1944, Sir Thomas Rich's became an 11 to 18 local authority grammar school, and the junior pupils transferred elsewhere. A new site for the school was purchased at Elmbridge in 1947, but for various reasons the new premises were not opened until 1964. Once the school moved to Elmbridge, the site and buildings in Barton Street were used by the Education Department of the City Council for some years. Now, St Michael's National School opened in May 1848 on a site on Russell Street, opposite the end of Bedford Street. And the school catered for infants and girls, boys going to London Road National School, which we'll hear about in a moment. And it took pupils up to school leaving age. In 1931, the city schools were reorganised, and St Michael's became a junior girls and infants school, taking 4 to 11-year-olds. In 1938, the former Jewish burial ground in Eastgate Street was purchased as an extension to the playground, the graves being moved to Treadworth Cemetery. The Jewish community in Gloucester had moved to Cheltenham during the 19th century. St Michael's School closed in July 1962, and the juniors transferred to the new King's Home Church of England Junior School. The school buildings were leased out and were still standing in 1997, although they have since been demolished and replaced with housing. Now, St Aldate's School stood in St Aldate's Square. It opened in 1869 as St Aldate's National School and replaced a parish school which had been held in a cottage in St Aldate's Square, which was just off St Aldate Street, and the backyard of what was until very recently the Debenhams department store is more or less on the site of St Aldate Square now. The new building was in the form of a parallelogram, and it stood on the southwestern side of the church across from the graveyard. The school appears to have mostly taken girls and infants, with a few young junior boys who then moved on to London Road National School. The school closed between 1885 and 1888, and the buildings were used for Sunday school and parish purposes. The site was sold to the Bon Marche in 1932, the proceeds being used to establish a charity for educational purposes in the parishes of St Aldate and St John. The church was demolished in 1963, having closed in the 1930s and been used as a parish room in the intervening period, and eventually the Bon Marche was extended and turned into Debenhams. Now, London Road National School stood between the railway and Great Western Road, more or less where the modern block where the pharmacy is today. And it opened in March 1817, the foundation stone having been laid by the Duke of Wellington in July 1816. In about 1835, the girls and infants moved to St Catherine's School in Priory Road, and the London Road School took boys only. As part of the reorganisation of the city schools in 1931, the senior pupils transferred elsewhere, and the school became London Road Junior Boys School. The school closed in July 1962, and the pupils transferred to the new King's Home Church of England Junior School. The site frontage was sold to Gloucester Corporation for the widening of London Road, and the rest of the site was sold for development. Now, St John's National School opened in 1847 on Worcester Street in a former nonconformist chapel on the western side of Worcester Street. It took girls and infants, probably mostly girls. By 1870, St John's was also operating a boys' national school in Black Dog Yard. The Worcester Street buildings were not considered suitable as a school by the late 1870s and closed in 1877. The school in Black Dog Yard, more or less where the traffic lights with the junction of London Road and Black Dog Way, appears to have continued as a boys' and girls' school for some years, as it appears on the first edition Ordnance Survey map in 1883. But by 1885 there was apparently no school in existence for the parish of St John. And because these two schools closed so very early, we don't have any records of them. We only have a few mentions, and they appear on a couple of maps. The Worcester Street building was sold in 1933, and the site is now occupied by a letting agent's shop. And although I'm not certain, I think it's still the same building because it's exactly the same shape as it was on the Board of Health map from the 1850s, which shows the school. Now we move on to St Peter's Roman Catholic School. The first parish school for Roman Catholic children in Gloucester was founded in 1835 in a loft above the sacristy of St Peter's Church. It later moved to premises near the Black Dog Inn, and in 1851 to larger premises in Northgate Street. In the early 1860s, a new St. Peter's Church and School were built, and the school opened in 1864 next to the church in London Road. The school was reorganised into separate mixed and infant departments in 1893, and it was the only school in Gloucester to remain an all-age school when the city schools were reorganised in 1931. Following the Education Act 1944, which required the division of all-age schools into separate primary and secondary schools, a new infant school was opened for St. Peter's on a site at Horton Road in 1953. A new junior school opened on the same site in 1957, and the London Road site became a secondary modern school. New premises were provided for the secondary modern school at a site on Stroud Road in Tuffley, opening in 1964, and this is still St. Peter's High School today. The former school building, meanwhile, is now used as a church hall by St. Peter's Church. It's the two-storey building that you can see at the back of the church. And that is another of the very few buildings that still exist.
Okay, so that's it for the digital story. I don't think we've had any questions in the chat, so we will just get straight on to the conclusion in that case. I hope you've enjoyed this session and maybe feel like you've learned something. You'll be able to find a map for the walk around the lost schools that we've looked at so that you can do that walk yourself, and that'll be on the events page on our website in the next couple of days. And if you want to watch the digital story again, we're going to be making this session available on our YouTube channel again within the next couple of days. Also on the events page, you'll be able to find a link to the Schools Records mini guide and the History of Education that I showed you earlier, and that will give you a little bit more starting points for your research and a few key dates and bits of legislation that shape the provision of education and will hopefully help you to understand the records a little bit more. We're going to email you an evaluation form over the next couple of days. Please, can you fill that in and return it to us? That would be really helpful. And if you've enjoyed this session, you may also like my colleague John Putley's training session on Victorian school records on Wednesday the 28th of April, again from 1 until 2 p.m. like this session has been. So thank you very much for coming along, and we'll end it here.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant, really interesting.